Welcome to week 11. This week we're covering chapter 13, which involves competition and public policy surrounding competitive issues. So this is not an extremely challenging chapter this week, model-wise or math-wise. And so I do urge you to read the chapter carefully. And in completing the discussion forum this week, in addition to our general regular questions that we may ask, did this video help to increase my understanding of the material and how? Do I still have questions and what are they? I also urge you to take a look at antitrust or merger and acquisition or restrictive practices news in the media. Take a look at what you might find out there. Do a little bit of reading and let me know what you see in the news. I think this would be an interesting opportunity for us to have some real world application of our microeconomic analysis. So this chapter takes a look at how the government will decide to balance the interests of corporations who desire less competition and consumers who benefit often from more competition. So the government will intervene in competitive practices to balance the interest of corporations versus private citizens. The first couple of concepts we need to know are what are mergers and acquisitions. And so I'm not going through all of the material in the text today. What I would like to mostly focus our attention on is restrictive practices, since I think when you look for news articles on competition and regulations, what you will find are discussions about different restrictive practices and whether a certain firm is being accused of entering into a restrictive practice or not. So a merger is when two formerly separate firms combine to form a single firm. They do this for practical purposes. We also call this acquisition when one firm purchases another, often combined with a merger. So you can see a merger is when two firms that are separate become one. And in many cases, what's happening is one firm is actually purchasing another firm. So it's both a merger and an acquisition. Generally, these types of actions, mergers or acquisitions, can reduce competition. So we will have laws which give power by the government to block mergers or acquisitions or even to break up an already existing firm. The body of law that does this is called antitrust law. So additionally, the government approves most mergers. They recognize the fact that most mergers are created to decrease costs or increase efficiencies in some way, which do end up benefiting the consumer. So at the same time that I'm saying that we have antitrust law that block potential mergers or acquisitions, many are actually passed through as the government feels that mergers can oftentimes increase efficiencies which benefit the consumer. And we have a couple of ways of looking at whether mergers or acquisition have the possibility of reducing product diversity or allowing a firm to increase prices, which could reduce competition. The Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, and the Department of Justice are the two organizations which will decide whether a merger can go through or not. And so historically, they used to use concentration and Herfindahl-Hirschman index calculations to determine whether there was too much concentration in the industry and if that concentration could possibly lead to anti-competitive behavior. So let's take a look at an industry, some hypothetical industry. The largest firm has, and we'll look at the four-firm concentration ratio, which looks at what percentage share of total sales in the industry is accounted for by the largest four firms. So it's looking at their market share of sales. And firm one makes 20% of sales in the market. Firm 2 makes 15%, firm 3 14%, and firm 4 10% of sales in the market. So when we add these firms together, we would find that the four-firm concentration ratio would be the sum of the market share of sales that each firm holds. So again, for example, firm 1 has 20% of sales for the entire market, firm 2 15, firm 3 14, and firm 4 10% of sales for the entire market. And so we add those together, we get 20 plus 15 is 35, plus 14 is 49, plus 10 is 59. So what this means is that the top four firms in the industry represent 59% of sales for the entire industry. Historically, an outcome less than 50% of the market share of sales is generally regarded as not a competitive, is not regarded as an issue that would impede competition, I think is a better way to say that. So our result could potentially impede competition, and this would be something that the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, or the Department of Justice might want to review. Additionally, they could look at the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index. So this takes the market share of each firm in the industry, squares, and then adds them together. So we know that for a monopoly with a market share of 100%, because a monopoly is the industry, 100 squared would give us a maximum value for the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index of 10,000, which is 100 raised to, I'm trying to look for my raised to button, well, 100 times 100, okay, or 100 squared. So let's do our calculation here. We'd have 20 squared plus 15 squared plus 14 squared plus 10 squared. And you'll notice that I am dropping the percentage and just saying that 20% is the 20, 15% is 15, 14% is 14, and 10% is 10. So 20 times 20 gives us 400. 15 times 15, which is 15 squared, gives us 225. 14 squared gives us 196. And 10 squared gives us 100. So therefore, our Herfindahl-Hirschman Index for the same firms in this hypothetical industry for which we did the four-firm concentration ratio calculation would be 400 plus 225 plus 196 plus 100. So we're not very close to 10,000 at all, and this would indicate that there is definitely not a monopoly situation. Something to think about in the interpretation of these statistics would be that in the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, larger emphasis is going to be given to larger shares of, or sales which happen for the percentage of the market. So a firm that has a 20% market share would be represented by as 400 in the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index and the aggregation of its impact to that index. However, if a firm had 50% market share, instead of only being 400, we would see that it now represents 2,500. So 20 times 20 gives us 400, but 50 times 50 gives us 2,500. So higher concentration or of market share percent of sales for a firm would represent a much larger impact in the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index approach than it would in the four-firm concentration ratio approach. Something to think about is that in the last 10 to 20 years, the antitrust enforcement authorities have moved away from relying as heavily on measures of concentration ratios and HHIs to determine whether a merger will be allowed. So now they're using more case-by-case analysis to determine the extent of competition in different industries and find out whether a merger or acquisition might be actually detrimental to consumers in a material way. A couple of issues with the methodology specifically would be it's difficult to define a market. When we're looking at a market, we might have firms that are producing in many different markets. They might produce one good or service that pertains to a certain industry, and outside of that industry produce another good or service also. So it's really hard to define the market that each firm actually rests in because they might actually produce in different markets. There are some firms that strictly produce in one market, for example, many car manufacturers. But if you look at a lot of technology products, like Google, for example, what does Google produce? They're a search engine. They also create technology which allow us to get from point A to point B. So they're vital in a lot of navigation systems in vehicles, which is very different than just being a search engine. They allow us to write email to one another, which is a form of communication, which is also very different than just being a search engine. So that's just one firm, and especially in the technology market, where they're actually involved in a lot of different industries. The other thing to think about is that the ratio analysis assumes that competition is the same in one industry versus another. So the competition in location services, as they go in your vehicle or in your handheld device like your phone, Google definitely produces maps, but there are other companies that do the same thing. And provide location services. And the competition in that space might look very different than the competition in the search engine space. And so when we're looking at different industries, also we have to think that also realize that competition might be very different in one industry versus another. So a high Herfindahl-Hirschman index in one industry might not actually be as big of a deal as it might in another industry versus in the same kind of frame of reference, the four-firm concentration ratio, if we saw a concentration of 59% of sales in one industry versus another, we might say, well, that is a very concentrated industry in one industry and not in another industry. A narrowly defined market will tend to make concentration appear higher, while a broadly defined market will tend to make it appear smaller. There's a very nice discussion on Microsoft, which I urge you to read, and it sort of discusses how you can define Microsoft either narrowly or broadly. And the more broadly you define Microsoft and its products, and broadly you define the industry in general that it exists in, you'll find that the concentration ratios are much lower. Further, there are concerns about globalization and technology altering how businesses function and how consumers purchase goods and services. So when we take into account globalization and technology changing, we also have to take a look at how this impacts different industries. And therefore, we have something that's changing vastly and wildly over time. And those concentration ratios that we used to rely so heavily on with the HHI ratio, or whether we're looking at the four-firm concentration ratio, might not give us the same information that they did 10 or 20 years ago. So analysis will be performed on a case-by-case basis. And antitrust regulation prohibits some of the below behaviors. Collusion is outright prohibited. So firms are prohibited from agreeing on fixing prices or output, for example. They can't say, okay, I'm going to charge this much for my laundry detergent and only produce this many units. Now, what are you going to do and how much are you going to charge? So those types of agreements are illegal. They also cannot divide their market by allocating consumers to one firm versus another. This is also an illegal practice. But there are some restrictive practices which the FTC or Department of Justice would take a look at and have to decide on a case-by-case basis whether these restrictive practices reduce competition. But they will not involve outright agreements, which is sort of an interesting implication. So one such type of restrictive practice is called the minimum resale price maintenance agreement. So this would be an agreement that requires a dealer who buys from a manufacturer to sell for at least a certain minimum price. I think you can all relate to this when you look at clothing that you purchase. If you purchase clothing that is manufactured by a different company than the one from which you buy it, one, say you're buying your clothes at a small retail boutique and they're purchased by a large wholesale manufacturer, there will always be a suggested minimum retail price. And this is totally fine to do. The difference being very subtle that the suggested retail price is really not that different than a minimum resale price maintenance agreement. The difference is that it is not a required minimum agreement. So suggested retail price in clothing is suggested and it's not required. Sales occur and clothing is sold at less than suggested minimum retail pricing when there are sales. But in a large part of transactions, you will see the suggested retail price being the minimum resale price that the manufacturer has set on that item. So we say that minimum resale price maintenance agreements are restrictive and they can potentially reduce competition, but in a lot of situations like suggested retail prices on clothing, we find that they are actually legal. Exclusive dealing is another gray area that could be investigated. Are there agreements that the dealer will sell only products from one manufacturer? Is that occurring? In a lot of cases, we'll say that that sort of business model is illegal. But car manufacturers are a great example of where it is legal. So dealerships are required to sell the cars that are manufactured by the car manufacturer for which is the brand that they are intending to sell, and they're probably only intending to sell that one brand. So GMC manufactures cars which are sold exclusively through GMC dealers, and that is how it is done, and we regard that as a totally legal practice. Tie-in sales are another potentially restrictive item. So a tie-in sale is a situation where a customer is allowed to buy one product only if the customer also buys another product, and we call this bundling. So bundling is a situation where a consumer is allowed to buy one product only if the consumer buys another product, also called tie-in sales. So tie-in sales and bundling are the same thing. And a lot of times tie-in sales and bundling are, I'll put also known as, are considered restrictive practices. But think about computer software. So when you buy your Apple MacBook Pro or you buy a Dell PC, whatever you are buying will come with software, and that software is sold with the computer. It's to be used on that personal computer that you purchased. And this is a legal and normal practice. Therefore, my laptop did not come with the Microsoft Office suite. It came with the vast array of software applications that Apple provides, and I am to purchase this computer with those bundled into the sale. This is not an illegal practice, however. But remember that any of these different things that we're talking about, whether we're talking about minimum resale price maintenance agreements, exclusive dealing, or tie-in sales and bundling, could be considered potentially restrictive to competition and would want to regard each on a case-by-case basis. The last sort of restrictive practice that you might want to look for if you were the FTC or Department of Justice in looking at mergers and acquisitions, or just a firm that's functioning out in the world, is the concept of predatory pricing. So predatory pricing is when an existing firm uses sharp but temporary price cuts to discourage new competition. It's hard to determine if this is truly occurring. Generally, we regard the average variable cost as the below firm price. So average variable cost is something which we have discussed when we looked at our firm in perfect competition, for example, when we analyzed the supply curve. What's going on there is that as long as a firm is selling above its average variable cost, then we would say that it is not predatory pricing. But if it's selling at prices below average variable cost, we could technically say that they are predatory pricing. Now, an issue with this, and you might find some news articles on predatory pricing, especially as they relate to globalization topics, is that it would be very difficult to determine a firm's average variable cost of production between determining what are fixed versus what are variable, and knowing the variable cost of production at different levels of production to see whether they are even pricing below that amount at all. That makes doing analysis on whether predatory pricing is occurring very difficult. So again, for your discussion forum post this week, I allow you to make reference to our regularly scheduled sorts of questions. Is this material something you've come across before? Did listening to the lecture aid your understanding of the material? Do you have any questions? But also take a look at what's out there in the news. Do we have different mergers or acquisitions occurring? Are they being blocked by FTC or the Department of Justice? Or are there any firms out there that and actually I do want you to make sure you know how to perform the 4-firm concentration ratio, or the Herfindahl-Hirschman index ratio calculation, or index calculation for the exam, but also looking at how is the FTC sort of coming at different firms, whether one firm is filing suit against another for potential restrictive practices, and what are the outcomes of those judicial reviews. So I hope you enjoyed this material. Please remember to read the rest of the text for helping you with the quiz and also with the final exam, and take good notes, and let me know if you have any questions. I look forward to reading your discussion forum posts. Have a great week.